Hi everyone, it's Chris, and today I thought I would bring you along while I build my FC26 career mode scoring system. So I was originally going to wait until I had this fully built to show it off, but I thought it'd be a really interesting video to show how I am creating this, how it works, and all of the different things that I'm going to add to this. So essentially what this is, I used to love career mode. I did stop playing career mode quite a few years ago and started playing Football Manager. But recently I've been wanting to get back into career mode. But what I find really difficult with career mode is I don't think the rating system on career mode is necessarily indicative of a player's actual ability. So I think the reason for that is there's so many different attributes versus Football Manager where I think there's only 20. And what that means is you end up with players who have particularly good attributes in certain areas, and that skews the game's overall rating system. And then also you do have to factor in, of course, the age, the value, and that kind of thing. So what I've essentially built here with the help of ChatGPT, and I'll show you a little bit in terms of the prompts that I put in, and I'm obviously still working on this as well. But what I've essentially built is this scoring system, which is actually quite complex, and there's quite a lot of different elements to it which I'm going to walk you through. And essentially what this allows you to do is assign a score to a player which factors in key attributes that are needed for that specific position, as well as age, value, and that kind of thing. So essentially what I'll just quickly walk through is the ruling. So this is the page that I've set up, and this is all done through Google Sheets. So it's completely free. You don't need to own Excel. Obviously, Google Sheets and Excel are very similar in a lot of ways. But essentially, this was my thoughts. So everything I put on here, I just wanted to make sure that I had it written down, so I knew exactly how this was going to work. Let me just close this. I've got two different tabs open. So essentially, on here, I've got all the different elements of how this is going to work, and then I will go into the inner workings of it in a minute. So the first thing I did in my ChatGPT window, which I won't scroll to because this conversation is very long, but essentially what I did was go through and ask ChatGPT what it thinks are the 5 most important attributes for each position. So you can see on the position profiles page, I have each position. I have defensive midfielder, centre midfielder, attacking midfielder, and obviously left attacking midfielder and right attacking midfielder use the exact same, as well as left back and right back. But essentially you've got each attribute and its weight. So obviously these weights add up to 1. At the bottom there you can see, so that's the same for all of them. And the point of that is to make sure that some attributes are treated as a lot more important than others. So for example, with a left back, you want the pace to be the most important thing typically. The stamina is then next important. Then you have standing tackle, you have crossing, and then you have defensive awareness. So essentially what this does is it assigns a weight to that specific attribute for each position. What you then do with that is you work out the CA score, which is the current ability score. So I've used quite a lot of abbreviations throughout this spreadsheet, which I will try and explain what they mean. What you then have to work out is the potential upside. So this is actually something that I was initially going to have, which was that you would take the potential and you would factor that into the way that the scoring works. So if you have, for example, a young player who's got a potential of 89, that will equate to them having a higher score than a player who is, I don't know, 82 overall, but is not going to increase anymore. You want to try and factor in younger players who are going to develop, because they may have a low score initially, but obviously they are going to improve and get better, and you want to try and represent that in your data and in the scoring that you give. This has now changed to a different score, just simply because on career mode there is no way of seeing your potential of the players within your squad. There are a few gimmicky ways of doing it, which I'll just quickly go through. So for example, if I go to my squad hub, obviously you can see, this might not work on this squad, but you have, there you go. So Gabriel Moscardo, his status is showing great potential. So that means he has a ranged potential of X. I can't remember exactly what it is for that specific tag, could be 81 to 84, I think. But that's not specific enough, and you can't really use that to work off data. Um, and it just makes it messy and it makes it confusing. It's annoying that there is no way of just seeing the potential of your players in your team. I've heard a few people say if you list the player up for loan, you can then go and search for them. I want to actually see if that works. So Gabriel Moscardo, if we go and try and search for him, some people say he doesn't come up. Yeah, and he's not coming up for me. So Gabriel, yeah, so he's not coming up. I wonder if you do for loan, from Liga. I mean, you can't even search for your own team, so I don't think that's possible. So that's obviously one of the biggest downfalls and means that you can't really use this metric specifically. So what I am going to do, just to make sure I don't get confused, is I'm just going to put a line through that. The next thing you do want to factor in, as I mentioned before, is age. So the age curve multiplier does that. So essentially what it does is it times your CA score by the score that it assigns here. So for example, if you have a 16 to 18 year old, you want to give them a little bit more credit for achieving that score at such a young age. So you times their value by 1.2. 19 to 21 years old, you times by 1.15, etc., etc. And then obviously as you get to 25, 27, which is typically peak, you then start going downwards just to prevent you from signing older players that are probably on their decline. You don't obviously want to try and steer away from them where possible. Next, you have a value efficiency score. So what this essentially looks at is the current ability score that we calculated up here divided by the player's value times 1,000. And the reason you do the times 1,000 is just because that number otherwise becomes quite small. I think I might have changed that slightly on the other screen, which we'll have a look at as well. Then you have the final recommendation score, which is, I think that has also changed as well. So this ruling tab I haven't necessarily kept completely up to date as I've been tweaking things, but a lot of it is the same. This is something that I do need to incorporate, so I'll try and do that on this video as well. Role fit score. This is my combat to the potential upside. So essentially, this is a manual calculation. So you'll look at a player and you'll say, they're fit for the role based on age, and you're kind of just making a very quick spot check. You just assign an extra 10, 5, 0, minus 5 points. So poor fit would be someone who is old, doesn't fit in the squad because he is aging, he's worth a lot, his wages are high, etc. You would obviously then give them a minus 5, or if they're unhappy as well, you could factor that in. So this is this is the most manual part of it, and it's just your overall fit for that player in your squad. And finally, you have the total player score, which again, this calculation might have changed. So I think what we'll do is we'll go into the squad screen. So this is essentially where all the magic will happen. So this is where you will put in your squad. I do need to make another tab for shortlisted players or players that you found, which will essentially be this. But what I'm going to work into the shortlist screen is you'll be able to compare that player versus the players in your club in that position, and I'll go into that as we go through. So this is my squad screen. I have done this with a few of my players on this save, which is just a PSG save that I was getting achievements on, and I've put some of these players in just to see how the scoring works out, to see if it is, kind of what we're looking for. So you have the name, you have the age, which is obviously calculated further on. You have the position, which I've created drop down, so you can select whichever position that player plays in. The value in millions, so you just put the number in here, so 56 million, 3.3 million, 71, etc. This then pulls through whichever are the attributes that have been selected under this position profile tab. So for example, if I come down here and I select the left attacking mid, it'll pull through whichever attributes are important for that specific role. So it just means you don't have to do this manually every time, and this just works off lookup formulas. So it's actually quite simple. Obviously this one just looks up the first one, second, third, fourth, fifth. So it's not the most complex thing ever, but it works quite well. Then Then we have the rating, which is literally just a number. So you would go through each person on your squad, you would check for these attributes, and you would put the number in there. Again, I need to format this and color code it just to make it a little bit easier to tell what's going on here, but I've just wanted to get this going quite early in this process. Then down here, which is where you get to some of the calculations. So the CA score is essentially what we did before. So you're looking up the position and you're looking up that value in the player profile or the position profile grid, and you're assigning it by whatever the weight is that's assigned on the position profile. So for example, this will look up the position of centre back and the number of 92, and it'll times it by whatever it is in centre back in here. It will times that stat by that amount, and that will give you obviously your CA score. So we have Ledley King, for example, who is an 88 overall, but in these specific attributes it gives him a score of 87.7. We have Noham Kamara, who's a 74 overall, but in the attributes that we've selected is only 71. And you can see how this affects. I was actually looking at the wrong thing there. That's just the rating for that attribute, so ignore what I just said there. Doesn't make sense. I do need to incorporate just an overall column in here, just so you can see how it compares. But what I was saying does still sort of make sense. So if we go into Squad Hub, and if I look at Ledley King, so Ledley King's an 87 overall. It's got him as an 87. Kamara's a 71. It's got him as a 71. Ashley Cole is a 88, which is about the same. Nuno Mendes is a 90. So it's interesting that a lot of these do actually carry over, which tells me that they are properly rated. Zaire Emery, for example, on the game, if I just flip to this, he's an 86 overall, and with the CA score we have a score of 87.3. So that tells me that his key attributes that we are measuring make him actually better rated than the game would suggest. And you can start to see where this would add a lot of value to being able to scout players. João Neves is 91 rated in-game and is 91 rated on here. So that tells me that the players I have, for the most part, have the right distribution of their stats and that their attributes are geared towards playing that position really well, which is a positive sign. Next we have the ACM, which is essentially the age curve multiplier. So this looks up the player's age and then assigns that age curve multiplier that we have specified. So obviously being 30 years old, that assigns a multiplication of 0.92. So that's returning that value here. Then we have the AAS, which is the adjusted ability score, and what this is essentially looking at is the current ability times the age curve multiplier to give a true current level of where this player is currently at. So we have someone like Ledley King, who because he's a lot older, it's showing him as a lot lower, whereas Noham Kamara, because he's a lot younger, his score is boosted slightly. Ashley Cole's is obviously dropped. We have Nuno Mendes, whose is pretty much the same. Zaire Emery, who again, because he's very young, he's seen quite a good boost to his, and the same with João Neves as well. We then have the VE score, which is the value efficiency score. This is where we start to look at the player's value to try and essentially work out how good a value for money this player is. So for example, Ledley King is 30 years old and is £56 million. So that tells me that that's not necessarily the best value for money, which is why his score is low, versus Noham Kamara, who is only 20 years old and is worth only £3 million, yet he has a score of 76.7. So that tells me that his score and his value is actually really good, and is a player that we might be interested in signing. Finally, the role factor score, was it? Role factor? Role fit score, which I've just kept at 5 just for the sake of making sure it works, but I could change some of these. And then finally, over here in column T is the final output, which is the transfer priority score. So this is the final metric that tells me how good a player is based on all these different factors that we've taken into account. So again, with them being in your squad, it's slightly different to if you were looking at players who you wanted to sign. And what I do want to do with this score is I want to try and put it into a metric out of 100, because this, for example, it's hard to kind of gauge what this means. So it's hard to essentially work out who is good and who's not, what is the score maximum, what should it be, that kind of thing. So what I want to work with ChatGPT to do now is almost translate this TPS score to more of a overall out of 100. Not sure how that's going to work, so let's just start working on it. So now we have a true player score, which is out of 100. So Zara Emery is the highest. Kamara is higher than Ledley King. So I guess if I'm going for the Moneyball angle, this is right. This is exactly what we want to see. We want to see Kamara scoring higher because he's much lower value, but probably brings much more potential to the table. So there's no issue there really at all. So I think this is in a pretty good spot. And now what I want to do, so I've done this for my squad tab, but I now want to do this for a shortlist type view where I can scout players to sign for my club. I also want to incorporate a feature that looks for players that are the same position within my squad and compares whoever I am looking to sign to see if they are worth it. Okay, so I've incorporated two extra columns. So we have the best squad TPS score, which will essentially look at my squad and see what is the best score for a player in whichever position we have specified. And then we also have a squad comparison score, which will look at this player's TPS versus the best and give me a score. So what I can then use this to do is factor in a decision. So if it's greater than 5, for example, I can have it display sign. If it's between 4 and 0, I can have it to consider, not sign, etc. So I think I'm happy with that. I think that's a really good metric and a really good comparison tool to have as part of this. What else could we incorporate? Okay, so I've made a few changes to this. I've added a little bit of conditional formatting. So the TPS score now has different color codes based on how good that score is. So I've set it to anything above 75 would show with green, anything between 65 and 75 is yellow, and anything lower than 65 is now shown as red. And I have also done the same with the normalized VE score, just to mean that it really shows me players that stand out in value. And obviously I'll copy these conditional formatting rules over to the scouting page as well, because that's probably where it's going to be the most helpful in terms of having a look and seeing those players that really do have the best value in the market. So I'm going to copy those rules over to the scouting page and then we'll see what's next. Okay, so quite a few changes have been made to the spreadsheet. So what I've essentially got now is a dynamic starter benchmark. So this goes off this here, which is the position rules. So what this is essentially looking at is each position, how many players are going to play in that position, and that all factors into the dynamic starter benchmark. So the reason that's important is this will look at the highest rated player in a position where they're in a single position, or if they're in a dual position, it will look at the top 2 highest rated players to determine what is the benchmark for starters in that particular position. So for example, a left attacking midfielder, obviously there is only one position in that particular position, which this is actually incorrect. So let me change that. I want that to be singular. So what that means is if I have a left winger on this shortlist, or a left attacking midfielder as I seem to have referred to it, it's going to compare the player that I'm scouting versus the top rated left attacking midfielder in my squad. Obviously I don't want it to look at the top 2, it might be that I have a big drop off from my starter to my rotation option, but that's essentially what that's doing. And then the rotation benchmark is essentially looking at the average. So what that means is, you can see here, this data is a little bit funny because I've obviously got my own players in the scouting, but you can kind of see where it already has a bit of an impact. So for example, this player, which is Nuno Mendes, he is showing as minus 4.5 versus a starter. So he might not necessarily join as a starter, but he is 0.8 TPS score above the rotation option within my squad, or above the average. So what this means is that he would actually be a good backup option, a good rotation option for the squad. And again, you can already see how this really plays into scoring players and being able to determine who's going to be good to sign for your team. I think at this point I'm pretty much ready to go. I think the next step is going to be inputting a whole squad's worth of data and really seeing how it stacks people up. So I think the next step is going to be the next episode where I jump onto the game, I create a new save, and I just input a load of data into here, see how it stacks up, see what sort of comparisons we're getting, and then we can determine if any more tweaks need to be made. I think it's really hard at the moment because I've only got like 5 players in here or 6 players in here. It's really hard to determine if it's actually pulling me the correct data and showing me the right things. But I really like the progress we've made. I feel like we're getting to a point where it's almost ready to use and you can almost start going out and scouting players. One thing that I will say is this is geared quite heavily towards the Moneyball style of football, where it really is showing where the value is. So for example, you can see the big outlier there at a TPS score of 80.2 is Noham Kamara, who is 20 years old. He's only 71 rated, but he is only valued at 3 million as well. So what this is telling me is that based on these attributes that we've selected for that role, he has a good enough score at a good enough age to the point where he would be highly recommended and would be a great player for me to sign. Of course, I have set his RFS score at 100, so if I do change some of these, that will obviously affect that as well. But yeah, for the most part, it's showing me that he is the best value for money, and that probably is true. You know, a player who's 20 years old, 71 overall, who has those attributes, a really good point for his rating, that's probably indicative of a player that you would look to sign. So quite happy with how it looks. Like I said, in the next episode I'm going to jump into an actual save and I'm going to input a load of squad data on here, which you'll see, and we'll see what that kind of looks like in terms of the scoring system. But yeah, thank you very much for joining. Let me know if you have any recommendations for things to do to this. I'd be happy to open this up to suggestions that people can think of. I do obviously want to change the visual, make it look a little bit better, but I'm just reluctant to do that while I'm still editing and tinkering around with the data and the columns and that kind of thing. But yeah, hopefully you guys found this really intriguing. I know for me it's opened up a massive not kind of worms, but just real intrigue into how you can apply this sort of data side of things to career mode that's really lacked that kind of thing over the years. I think Football Manager has a lot more of this. People naturally, with the numbers, end up doing things like this with the Moneyball that we see a lot of YouTubers do. But this is almost a way of building Moneyball into career mode, which I think is really fascinating. So, yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.